Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about something I saw in a comment that somebody made. But I have also to say that this is not the first time I've seen somebody say this. I've seen similar comments in the videos that I've made, and I also have to say that I've made a video that kind of insinuated something like that. And is the question of whether the so-called Cushites are people who came from outside Africa. Of course, there's a video I made saying that the Oromo people, there are some documents from the 17th century, I think maybe 16th and 17th century and 18th century, documents that talk about the Oromo being people who came from elsewhere. And mostly this document insinuates that the Oromo people, or at least some part of the Oromo people, came from Europe. But also these comments about the Kushites in general, that's of course the Somali, the Oromo, and other ethnic groups that belongs in that category, that they came from elsewhere and then came to Africa. But that is a very, number one, the first thing I have to say about that, and this is something I've said before, is that the use of the words like Kushites and Bantu, these are words that we use so carelessly. We use them so carelessly because the assumption is that when we say Kushites, we mean the genetics of the people. But where these words started being used, Kushites, Bantu, Nilotes, they were not about the genetic of the people. They were about the linguistic, the language that the people used. Now, there is this assumption that language and genetics go together. Up to some extent, yes. People who speak the same language are more likely to be genetically related than those who don't, but that's not always the case. There are people who speak the same language, but they are not genetically related. For example, we speak English, we are not related to the British, genetically speaking, and the same to languages like Arabic. And we think that these languages, Arabic, English, Swahili, that those ones are kind of different from languages that we speak as vernacular languages, for example, Somali, Luo, or Kikuyu. They are languages, they are all languages. And so languages spread, languages move, and sometimes they move without the people who speak them because they move from one group of people to another. Now, coming back to the question of the so-called Kushites. Now, Kushites is a language group, at least that's my understanding, and I know there are so many people who disagree with me. And when we say Cushitic languages, we mean the language of the Oromo and the language of Somalia, kind of like they are similar in so many ways, so they were put into the same group. But that does not necessarily mean that the genetics of the people who we call the Somali people and the genetic of the people we call the Oromo are necessarily related, or even the people who speak Somali doesn't necessarily conclude that they are related. Of course, over time, because they live in the same area, speak the same language, and share culture, of course, there is intermingling. Now, looking at history, of course, at this point, there is little doubt that the people we know today as the Somali people have been around for a very long time. Archaeological evidence show that these people have been around for at least 7,000 years in the Horn of Africa. And not only them, of course, with other groups of people, of course, the Oromo and all these other groups of people have been around for a very long time. Now, having said that, people have always moved. And sometimes when we say, oh, these people did not belong here, or these people came from elsewhere, we assume that there are people who have been at the same place forever. That's not true. People have always moved. People have moved from one place to another. People have moved from one continent to another. Sometimes from maybe Asia to Africa and back and back. People have moved like that. People have moved out of Africa, gone elsewhere, came back. So if you look at history and you put things in perspective of, say, 10,000 years or 15,000 years, then you start realizing that the idea of certain people belonging to a certain location on earth is absurd. People have always moved. So did the Somali people come from outside of Africa? It's hard to say, but they have been here for thousands of years. The same argument can be made for all the other groups of people in Africa. And in fact, all the other groups anywhere on earth, we can say, for example, we can say that the Bedouin tribes in the Arabian Peninsula came from elsewhere. And that could be true, that if you go far back enough, you'll find that they were not there at some point. They came from elsewhere. And there were other people there who moved to another place. That's how humans have always existed. Now, looking at the very recent history, of course, the people, the so-called Cushites, and I'm saying the so-called because I don't believe that Cushite is about the genetics of the people. It's about the language that the people use, and sometimes language and genetics don't go together. Now, if I talk of Somali people, for example, there are some evidence that some clans of the Somali people are people who came, or their ancestors, at least one side of their ancestors are people who came from maybe Saudi Arabia, what we know today as Saudi Arabia. That these are people who came from there and came and settled with the local tribes and married and intermarried, and of course they became locals, they became Somali. And there are those that have been around for thousands of years, and they haven't moved, or they have not had, or they can't claim that their ancestors came from elsewhere. But even then, those who have ancestors who came from elsewhere and those who have been around for long enough, all of them have, of course, in 100, 200 years, they've again intermingled, and we can hardly say who has what genes. And the same thing can be said of, say, the Tigray or the Amhara. They are, of course, those who I read a document recently where we were talking about the war that went on between the Sultanate of Adal and Abyssinia, and there was also the war that went on by with different groups in that region. And there is this time when, of course, the Portuguese came to save Abyssinia, and then when they won the war, most of the Portuguese soldiers chose not to go home, and they stayed in Abyssinia and married local women. So there are so many people in Ethiopia today. If you ask them, they will say, I'm Amhara, or I'm a Tigre or Tigrinya, but they do carry some Portuguese blood, and some of them don't know. Many of them don't know, because many of us don't even know our history long past our grandparents or past our great grandparents. There are people who are lucky to know generations, but for the average person, we just know up to our great grandfather, and beyond there, we don't know. So we don't know what is in the past, and it's the case for all of us. So when we say, oh, these groups of people came from elsewhere, that's absurd, especially when you think in terms of duration, long duration of time. It doesn't make sense, because people have always moved. People have always intermixed and intermingled and intermarried, and new tribes emerge, or people come and swallowed by one tribe, another tribe swallows another, two tribes meet, they merge, they become one. That's how history has functioned. So as far as Cushites being from elsewhere, it depends what you mean, or it depends the duration of time we are looking at. If we are talking about maybe 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, no, these people have been here for a very long time. If you are talking about 15,000 years, maybe, then we can start talking of maybe they had gone, left, came back, whatever. But that then applies to every group of people. There is no one group of people that we can say that has been at one place for a very long time, and their gene pool has not been mixed with others. That doesn't happen. So yeah, Kushites are the so-called Kushites again. These are indigenous people of the Horn of Africa. Those are my random thoughts.